thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Salina and at this beautiful country club. The facility here is just tremendous. I saw the picture back there that this was dated back in 1960 something is when it was built. It really has worn well. This is a very classic architecture. I really enjoy coming here. So thank you for having us out here today. I'm here to talk about the real estate market, and every year at the Center for Real Estate, we do an annual housing forecast. It's really focused on single-family homes, but I will talk a little bit about, multifamily and two-family and some other things as we go forward. At your tables, I should mention here, the slides for my presentation are available on the Center for Real Estate website now. That distortion on the side, that is not a QR code, so don't blame me for wherever you go if you click on that. Instead, go directly to our website at wichita.edu/real estate, and there you can see our slides. There should be Salina Economic Outlook Conference presentation right there, so you can follow along if you want and look ahead, challenge me on things and so forth. At your tables, you have a copy of the Saline County Housing Outlook for this year, and that's made possible because of generous support from Credit Union of America. And so I want to make sure that we thank them, and I mean you should thank them as well. It's because of them that we're able to print these beautiful publications. And we also have a partnership with the Kansas Association of Realtors, and through them, the Great Plains Association of Realtors here in Salina, that we are able to access all the multiple listing service data across the state, put those together, prepare monthly statistical reports for the local associations, but that also gives us the benefit of having access to the data that allows us to do the work that we do. So we're very grateful for that. I'll talk about this slide here in just a minute, but I wanted to mention a couple things first. First, you will notice the theme that we went with here and kind of the idea and thought that we had. There's kind of a subtitle called Market Distortions. And the real idea that we had as we began to put together this year's housing forecast was that we have been in such a strange, bizarre world that the comparisons that we normally make, how are we today compared to where we were a year ago or 2 years ago? Those don't make any sense because the market has been so distorted. And so we need to tune in our television sets and get back to a place where we can kind of get a clear picture of what's happening in the market. And that's my goal and focus with what we have. So as we do, so that was the first thing I wanted to mention before this slide. The second thing I wanted to mention is that what we do when we do our annual housing forecast is I look at two fundamentals. I look at the labor market and ask, how are households doing? Do they have jobs? Are their incomes growing? Will they be able to afford and buy a new house if they decide they want one? And number two, we look at the mortgage market and we ask, can people get the financing they need to buy that house if they decide that they're ready to be in that purchase? So those are the two fundamentals. I am not talking at all about the labor market fundamentals today because Jeremy and Jonathan talked a lot about what's been going on in that side of the economy. My takeaway from all of it is that the labor markets are still providing ample demand for housing markets. That there's nothing about the employment situation or the wage situation that is causing people to back out and say, ooh, I'm afraid, I don't want to buy a house, I don't want to be in the market. Okay? So that's creating a strong element of demand. The financing side, however, has had a big negative impact on demand in the housing market. And that's because of the very rapid, historically fast increase in mortgage rates that we experienced over the past little over a year now. And so to think about that, and to think about what's going to happen going forward with mortgage rates, I want to think about what builds into that mortgage rate that we all pay, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. So what goes into making up that 30-year fixed mortgage rate? Well, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate is tied in part to expected inflation, okay? When inflation is higher, and it's not actual inflation, it's what we think inflation will be going forward, that has to be built into the mortgage rate because lenders want to get paid back in real stuff, not just green pieces of paper. And inflation erodes how much stuff those pieces of paper can buy. And so I have here a discussion about what's been happening with inflation expectations. The blue line at the top is the consumer price index. It's the headline inflation, the year-over-year percentage change. And we're all very familiar with how much inflation accelerated over the last year, a couple of years, peaking out at almost 9% at the highest point there. It has since then come down dramatically, and the latest inflation number was just reported this morning, and basically the same as it was last month. We're in that mid to upper 3 range for that inflation. I will just note, not shown on here, but the measure of core inflation, or the CPI less food and energy, it actually has continued to come down. And so that, I think, is hopeful news that we're continuing on that right path of bringing down an actual inflation. But as I said, what we care about more is inflation expectations, what will happen in the coming year. And so you can see on here, the red line is a survey that's done by the University of Michigan asking households, what do you think inflation will be over the coming year? And you can see that it had been much lower. When inflation ran up so high, it had been much lower, that expectation, than actual inflation. It's now back to a more normal situation where expected inflation and actual inflation are about the same. But that's a survey of households. A better measure, and one that really reflects where financial markets are, that would go into the mortgage rate, is this bottom green line, which is something called the 5-year break-even rate. It's kind of a strange name, but what it does is it looks at regular Treasury securities and then these special Treasury securities that are indexed to inflation so that they don't have to build in a risk premium for inflation on them. And the difference in the interest rates between those traditional Treasury securities and the inflation index securities gives us a measure of what financial markets believe expected inflation will be over the next 5 years. And this is more than just asking somebody, what do you think inflation will be? People are actually betting hundreds of billions of dollars in these securities as to, and part of what's factoring in is which type of security they buy and invest in is what they think inflation will be. So you can think of it like the Vegas line for inflation. And you can see that that's been sitting relatively low, just a little bit over 2%. I think it's like 2.2% was the most recent figure. And what that means is that financial markets believe over the next 5 years, average inflation will be about 2.2%. That's within striking distance of the Federal Reserve's inflation target of 2%. The question is, how will we end up getting from where we are now of 3.5% inflation down to that 2% level? And is that something that the Fed is going to say, you know what, we're moving on the right path, let's just kind of wait and see and let things go? Or will the Fed say, nope, we're not there yet. We're going to get it there. Financial markets believe we're going to get it there, and we are going to keep jacking up short-term interest rates until we get there, okay? I don't know the answer to that. I'm hopeful they will take the former path, take a wait and see, let's be cautious, but we shall see over the coming months how much more aggressive the Federal Reserve will be. Nevertheless, the only way that mortgage rates would go up substantially from where they are right now would be if we had a sudden increase in expected inflation. That would have to cause mortgage rates to go up. Or if we saw the 10-year Treasury rate go up substantially. That 10-year Treasury rate is actually something that has been going up here quite a bit recently. So there's a lot to look at on this slide. So let me work my way through it. The top line is the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. And I did a historical perspective, so I went all the way back to 1985 with that. One thing to keep in mind with the mortgage rates where we are right now, which is in the 7.5% range, is that while it seems like, oh my goodness, these are outrageously high mortgage rates, if you look at the post-financial crisis era, so go back to 2008, 2009, that blue shaded region on there is the recession that we had, the Great Recession. Back prior to the financial crisis in the early 2000s, a mortgage rate of 6% we thought that was like nirvana. That was fantastic. It was the best mortgage rates we could ever imagine happening. After the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve became very deeply involved directly in the mortgage market by buying mortgage-backed securities. They'd never done it before. And so that created an environment of artificially low mortgage rates where we dropped down around 4% and to lows that were below 3%. We got very used to that, but I'm not sure that we should have gotten used to that. It's not consistent with what you should think of as normal rates in a healthy economy with low inflation and solid economic growth without that distortionary effect of the Fed. So mortgage rates are a lot higher right now than they have been, but they're probably not high historically speaking if we take out the weird period of time. The second line on there is the 10-year Treasury rate. And that is often thought of as a benchmark from which the 30-year fixed mortgage rate would adjust. The 10-year Treasury rate is going to go up if we have higher expected inflation. The 10-year Treasury rate also goes up if we need a higher real growth rate and interest rate. And I'll just mention that I think we're back more in an era and a range of that 10-year Treasury that we should expect to see going forward. Again, historically speaking, we're back to where we were in the early 2000s. That post-financial crisis era was far too strange. That quantitative easing made it an artificial world. Not everyone agrees that we are back to a time that 10-year Treasury rates will stay at this level going forward. In fact, Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, columnist for the New York Times, he just had an article here about a week ago where he talked about how some of his research looks at and thinks that because of lower population growth that we have, that should be leading to lower in real interest rates that we have, and therefore a lower level of the 10-year Treasury. But he notes that even though that's where he believes things will go, that he could be wrong and that there are differing views on that. So I disagree. I'm not going to claim to be a Nobel Prize winning economist, but that's going to be a key thing to look at for thinking about mortgage rates going forward. I think that we're getting close to where, absent an uptick in inflation, we're about at where that ought to be. He thinks the 10-year Treasury will go down. That would make mortgage rates even better. But my point here is that I don't see us having a substantial uptick in the 10-year Treasury and therefore mortgage rates going forward. I saw somebody had some article or something about people forecasting mortgage rates going up over 8%, 8.5% next year. And I just know, unless we have a bout of inflation, I just think that's highly, highly, highly unlikely. The lower line on here, however, is very interesting, and it's a unique situation. So that is the difference between the 10-year Treasury security and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And it's the premium added interest that you and I have to pay because, believe it or not, we're not as good a credit risk as the federal government. And so we have to pay a higher interest rate for that 10-year Treasury than for our mortgages than the federal government pays on the 10-year Treasury. Historically speaking, you go back on that, and the average going back to 1985 is about 1.7% premium. Right now, it's just under 3%. And it's gotten as high a couple times in the past. But this is abnormally high risk premium for mortgages. And I'm not quite sure what's causing that to be true right now. If I knew, I could do a better job of predicting what would happen with it. But when I look at it, I say, traditionally, we don't tend to spend that long of a time with this high of a mortgage risk premium. And so that gives me hope that that mortgage risk premium would come down. And if it comes down back to more normal levels, that gets us down to 6.5% mortgage rates just by eliminating that excess mortgage risk premium. Does that make sense? By taking 10-year Treasury where we are, expected inflation relatively low and not coming up, that gets us down to lower mortgage rates. Both the Mortgage Bankers Association and the National Association of Realtors are forecasting that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate will fall over the coming year. And National Association of Realtor forecast is down to 6% by the end of next year. Mortgage Bankers is even more optimistic. If you had to put my foot to the fire and say, give me a number, I would probably lean more towards 6.5% by the end of next year. But I don't formally forecast it, and so I use their numbers when I do my analysis and going through things. So, any questions about that? My takeaway from all of this is that mortgage rates have put a damper on demand, but that I think that damper is easing for two reasons. Number one, I do believe mortgage rates will fall over the coming years. And number two, I think there's an element of it where we just have to acclimate. You know, it's getting colder outside, right? And so we have to acclimate to the new weather. And the first day that it turns 45 degrees outside, we're all going to be walking around in our warmest winter coats, terribly frustrated with how freezing, bitterly cold it is. But once it gets really cold in the winter, and we come back out, you know, we spend those days below zero, we'll all be walking around in t-shirts and flip-flops when it's 35 degrees because we think it's really warm. There's just, once we adjust to it, we get back to more normal behavior. And I think that's true with this mortgage rate as well. Okay, so both of those should provide some additional stimulus for demand going forward. So what's been happening in local housing markets? These are the actual home sales reported by the Great Plains Association of Realtors. Monthly sales, the red lines on here are moving averages to see through these trends. The big numbers back in 2009, 2010, I was skeptical of those, but I went ahead and left them in. There have been changes in multiple listing service and mergers across things, and those big numbers back there, Dave, you can tell me if we really did have that kind of a big sales activity back in 2010, 2011. But regardless, the trend since then, you can see, been averaging 60 to 70 home sales a month for a long period of time. And then after the pandemic hit, all that stimulus that both the federal government gave and the Federal Reserve did by lowering mortgage rates caused sales activity to increase pretty dramatically. Since mortgage rates went up last year, that caused sales to drop off very sharply as well. Back really for Saline County at a level where we were previous to the pandemic. But demand to sales is the result of the two sides of the story. You have the demand for homes and you have the supply of homes available. And the supply side of the story is one that hasn't gotten any better since the pandemic. So this is the number of active listings, and you can see over the course of the last decade or so prior to the pandemic, steadily whittling down what was probably excess inventory in those early years, down to a more balanced level, and then it dropped pretty dramatically with that big jump in demand. We had all these people wanting to buy homes. We sold a lot more homes. It meant that there's less out there for everybody who's interested in buying. So there's a real shortage of inventory. Yes, it's come up a little bit in recent months, but not nearly to the level where it was prior to the pandemic. We measure balance in the housing market through this number called months supply. And I know many of you were here last year, but some of you may be new. Months supply we measure by taking the number of active listings and dividing it by the average pace of sales over the past year. And so if we have, say, 500 homes on the market and we sell on average 100 homes a month, we would take 500 divided by 100, 5 months supply of inventory available. We traditionally think, and this is just a rule of thumb, but we think a balanced market is one that has between a 4 and a 6 month supply. And so you can see a slight shading that I have there between 4 and 6 months up there. Well, for Kansas as a whole, we dropped below that starting in 2015. We dropped into what we might think of as a seller's market, and it continued to decline. Saline County has been in a real sharp, real tight inventory for an extended period of time, but it only got worse following the pandemic, with now about a 1.5 month supply of homes that are available for sale. As I said, the 4 to 6 window is just a rule of thumb. There's nothing magic about it. But at 1.5 month supply, there's no question that when buyers are going out looking for things to be able to buy, it is a tight market with very little that's available. And so as a result, our forecast for home sales activity across the state, and we don't forecast Saline County specifically, but our forecast for home sales across the state, we will be down in Kansas about 12% this year. That's actually a little bit better than where we are year to date. And the reason for that is that it was about this time last year that sales really began to tail off because of the higher mortgage rates. And so thus far this year, all of our year-over-year changes have been compared to these really high levels we had in early 2022 because of the juiced up demand from the pandemic stimulus. We're now in the place where we're about to stabilize those month-over-month changes. So our declines are continuing, but they're not nearly as bad. And our forecast for next year is about the same. It's home sales next year. That is not because of a lack of demand. As I said, we think demand is still pretty strong. But it's a lack of sales, of supply, of inventory that's available that's causing us to not see an increase in sales activity next year. So when you have that situation where you have relatively strong demand, but you have a shortage of inventory, you should see prices respond, and we have been seeing that. This is the median sale price in Saline County over the past several years, going back to 2009. And steady appreciation over a lot of that time, but then really picking up post-pandemic. And now up to a place where the median sale price is just under $175,000. By the way, just to clarify, median sale price, it's the price at which half of all homes sold for more and half of them sold at a lower price. So it's a good indicator of the middle of the market. It's also the case that following the pandemic, we saw a big increase in the percentage of homes that would sell at a price that was either at or above the original listing price. This is a real indicator of it being a seller's market because buyers are not negotiating the sale price down. And what you can see is here, even if that's come down just a little bit here over the last couple of months, we're still in a place where about half of all homes that are selling in Saline County are selling at a price that is at or above that original listing price, compared to between 20 and 40% that we had prior to the pandemic. So it is still very much a seller's market, which continues to put pressure on home prices. The median sale price, we saw that it was going up. The challenge with the median sale price is that it can get mixed up with the composition. If all of a sudden we started selling a lot of lower end homes, selling them really rapidly in the market, that would cause the median sale price to fall. But it could be that actual home values are going up. It's just that we're selling more of the lower priced homes. So to get around that, the FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Agency, has a measure of home price appreciation that tries to control for the quality, the type of house that's sold. They don't provide that specifically for counties, but they do provide an index for all of the non-metropolitan areas in the state. So any counties in Kansas that are not a part of the Wichita, Kansas City, Lawrence, Topeka, or Manhattan metropolitan areas, those are included in what I call here rural Kansas counties. The thing I want you to take away from this is that rapid increase in home price appreciation that we saw is not just a big city phenomenon. It was widespread across the state over the last couple of years. The appreciation rates have slowed here recently. Don't take the downward slope in this line to mean, oh, we're having a crash. You see the dark zero line there? Anytime these lines are above zero, it means that home prices are higher now than they were the year before. And so what's happening is that home price appreciation is just slowing to a rate that is much more typical for Kansas. Our forecast is that Kansas home prices on average will increase about 5.5% this year when we finish out the year, and then grow by another 3.5% next year. That's not the insane appreciation that we saw the prior 2 years, but we've never seen appreciation like that in the past. And so instead, we think we're getting back to what is much more normal levels of appreciation that we should see in a healthy market. The challenge with it, and the reason that we're in such supply issues that we have, is due to a lack of home construction across the state. This is across the country. And it really began following the financial crisis. We just haven't been building enough homes. And if you're just a little bit short on building homes, but you do that continually for 15 years, it puts you in a place where you are in really tight inventories, and it feels much more like a crisis. But it's been building for a long period of time. This year, new home construction has dropped tremendously. New homes were hit more by the increase in mortgage rates than any other segment of the market. We are forecasting a slight increase in new home construction next year. That's predicated on the belief that mortgage rates will in fact fall next year, that will have a positive impact on new home construction. But it's still really low and not nearly what we need to solve the inventory problems. That is the summary of my forecast. My timer says I have 5 seconds left. And so Jeremy is going to open up some question and answer things later, and so I'd be happy to answer questions later when we get there. Thanks once again to Credit Union of America for sponsoring this forecast. And I did want to mention, over on the table over here, we prepare much more detailed, full forecast publications for each of the major markets across the state. I have copies of those over here, and I thought you particularly might be interested in our Manhattan housing forecast. But all of them are over there, so please feel free to take them. And with that,
We're 10 minutes ahead, so this is a perfect time to ask questions about housing while you're here.
okay, I just didn't want to overtake my time. So are there questions about housing? Yeah.
How do you think the interest rate block or bonds can affect?
So the question is about how will the fact that we have all of these home buyers, homeowners out there who got these really low mortgage rates and they're now locked into their houses. They don't want to go and buy a new house even if rates drop down to 6.5%. Why would I want to give up my 3% mortgage rate and move into a 6.5% rate? I tend to think that that's an overstated concern. Certainly there will be some of that. But remember that you go back historically, this is not the first time we've been in an era where we have rates that are substantially higher than they had been in the recent past. You go back to the early 1980s, we had mortgage rates that were 10, 12, 14, 15%. And there were a lot of people buying at those really high mortgage rates that were giving up their unbelievably low 6% mortgages. What drives home purchase decisions tends to be family and personal life situation issues. Oh, I got married. I got a new job. We had kids. Kids moved out. I got divorced. We relocated for that. Those are the things that drive that. And at some point, those life issues make people say, the current housing that I have isn't suiting my needs, and I'm ready to move into something else. The one segment where I do think, and there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about this just this week, that I do think could be a factor with that, is that there was traditionally been that moment when people downsize, right? So, oh, the kids have moved out, we don't need to have all this house. Let's buy something smaller. It used to be the case that you could sort of upgrade the quality of your house, but make it actually no more, expensive, maybe even a little less expensive by downsizing. That's really hard right now because of the high construction costs and higher mortgage rates. And so some of those sellers those are the ones I think are more likely to be locked in because that's a unique situation there. Yeah, Eric.
Dr. Longhofer, great. Thanks for a great presentation.
It's Stan with you. You know that.
You mainly focused on single-family residential.
Yeah.
Can you interact, this question answer period, a little bit about where multifamily, those kinds of things, and how do they fit into that niche of how does a community marry those two together to solve housing problems?
Yeah, so the question was about how does I focus on single-family housing, and that's what we forecast, but how does multifamily fit into the whole picture with that? The thing to remember is that a household is defined as a group of people living together in a housing unit, okay? So the number of households is the number of occupied housing units by definition, okay? That housing unit could be a multifamily attached. It could be an apartment. That's a housing unit. It could be a single-family residence that's rented or owner-occupied. Multifamily could be renter or owner-occupied. And then we also have those duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes that fit in there as well. All of those, even though we've had a real boom in apartment building over the last 5-7 years, it still hasn't overcome the shortage. And if I took that same picture that I had that showed single-family building permits, it would look a little bit better when we included multifamily, but still not enough. So we still have a shortage of new home construction. Part of that is driven by the fact that average household sizes are continuing to shrink. We have fewer people in each housing unit today than we did. It just continues to get smaller. In fact, I think last year I did a little back of the envelope calculation for that, and I said statewide, if we had the same number of people per household, if the decline in the number of people per household that we've had since 2000, holding population constant, would require an additional 50,000 housing units just to accommodate fewer people per housing unit. So all of those things come together to build into this. Other questions? Okay, well now I'm almost 6 minutes over my time. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer more questions later. So thank you all very much.